Hello, everybody. I am joined by Martin Harris, aka Seamus, who has been a personal friend for a long time, a writer in the poker industry for a long time, and recently came out with a book, Poker and Pop Culture. Now, Seamus, this has been something which has been a long time in the making, and it in fact coincides with a course that you teach, Poker and Pop Culture, which I think is fantastic. If we were to evangelize the world into the poker community, it's step one to get these younger kids involved. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about that course and what it's been like for you to sort of share the world of poker, both real and in the media, with young people.
I teach this class. It's in the American Studies program at UNC Charlotte, and it's actually called Poker in Film and American Culture. And I actually started teaching it in 2011, and it was in the spring of 2011, so it was the spring, the time when Black Friday happened. It happened during the time that I taught that course for the first time. And so that first semester, I had mostly guys, mostly online poker players in the course, and they were really hardcore. And then after that, things changed, and the demographic of the class changed. I've been teaching it ever since, so 8 years I've been having new classes come in. And so I have more of a mix of men and women in the class. Poker players and non-poker players sign up for it. And so there are people who are really into poker, and then there are people who don't know anything about it. And so I teach them how to play poker a little bit at the beginning of the course, and then we do the history of the game. And then we talk about poker in movies and popular culture and how those representations of poker sort of reflect American values and comment on the game and what it means to America, but also says things about the country and what it finds important and significant.
So that's one of the things that I thought was the most interesting. You basically take poker from its uber infancy. I mean, we're talking about essentially the beginning of the country, at least at a minimum, and then all the way up until modern times. And for me, I had to imagine that there's so many stories, there's so much folklore, but really actually finding out the history behind poker has to have been an incredibly large task.
Yeah, I gave myself this ridiculous challenge to write this book because it's a history of poker, so I'm telling you about how the game began at the beginning of the 19th century and all the way up to the present and online poker and everything. But I also am trying to tell this history of poker in popular culture, and so I'm going through all of these examples of poker in the movies and on television, radio shows, magazines, and all these kind of mainstream presentations of poker, which aren't necessarily accurate to what poker is like, but kind of embellish it and present a particular version of poker. But basically, so I'm giving myself kind of two books to write in one. And so, yeah, it was a lot. And there was a lot of research going into it. And it took a long time, but I'm happy that it's finally here.
So I think that there's, it'll come as no surprise basically to anyone in the poker industry that there's plenty of people that say perceive it as, more similar to blackjack than to the stock market or there's very clearly some misperceptions about what poker really looks like. Was there anything surprising to you, or what are some of the takeaways from you really looking at how it seems like poker has been represented in the mainstream culture and how people seem to perceive it that aren't a part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a poker player and a fan, and I like poker enough to write a whole book about it. And I think it's valuable to study and to look, I sort of see a lot of positive things about poker. And so really, I guess, as I wrote the book and as I got deeper into it, I was maybe not exactly expecting how consistently negative the portrayals of poker would be. If you think about like something like television westerns, and we just sort of think of poker as being like, the hats they wear and the horses and the guns and everything else. And maybe think of it in a more benign way. But if you're not a poker player and you're watching a TV Western, and poker is a source of big trouble in those shows, like every time every time they sit around the poker table, the guns end up coming out. And it's because there's cheating and so on. And so poker's got that association with cheating and with gambling and with other morally objectionable activities. and it's pretty consistent. And so that's something, as I wrote the book, I found kind of intriguing to write about. I tried to be objective as a historian and not like, keep jumping in and saying, wait, that's not right, poker's okay, but instead present it in a way and let the reader sort of see all these portrayals of poker in the movies and TV and so forth, and decide sort of what I'll give you maybe a little guidance about what I think it means, but I give you a chance to sort of think about what you think of it.
Of course, so obviously you're not wanting to inject your opinion too much, but I'm curious because, I think for a lot of people in the poker community, we would say, look at a movie like the movie about Bobby Fischer or something like that and say that, poker is more closely related to something like chess than it is to something like blackjack, or at least it's as close to that than the other thing. And clearly it's not perceived like that. So I'm interested if you, was there anything surprising, or why do you think that poker, for example, has been perceived so much in this way when and really the elements of the game, the strategy, the statistical things, the mathematics things, why do you think those things are so clearly ignored, even though as a society we do obviously value these intellectual games and strategy-based games? Why do you think poker has ended up in such a negative light?
Yeah, well, I think, the association of poker with these other gambling games is something that it happened at the very beginning. In fact, in the beginning of the book, the first few chapters, I talk about attitudes towards gambling in the early decades of the country. And all of that there was already a lot of sort of negative sentiment when poker emerged. And then for much of its history, and for some people still today, poker was just part of that. And so these negative opinions were already there. I have a chapter about basically kind of the history of poker strategy books, which I think maybe poker players especially will find interesting. And you have all these guys, this is the late 19th century, writing books of strategy about poker. And so they should be like, and here we are talking about strategy, right? And some of them are pointing out how it's a skill game. But they're also apologizing profusely for writing about poker and for maybe encouraging anyone to play this horrible game.
This horrible strategy game.
Yeah, which is going to, you're going to get in trouble and get cheated and put yourself in danger and so forth. And my favorite is a lot of those guys use pseudonyms. And one of them, just instead of even inventing a pseudonym, he just signed, the book was written by one of its victims. And that kind of gives you an idea. And really, but if you think about it, it's not until much later in the 20th century that writers of strategy books are less apologetic about what they're doing. And so that's just like one form of representing poker. Think about sort of people who are making movies or writing fictional stories or, creating like television programs and so forth. What are they going to do with poker? How are they going to use it? Are they going to bother to go to the effort of showing you that poker is a skill game? Or are they going to use poker to generate some conflict and make something interesting happen to keep people watching the shows and be curious about it? So.
Well, that was going to be my next question I wanted to ask you, because I think we've seen, for example, with Molly's Game, I know in Ballers, there have been some very recent looks at poker in the mainstream media that have been at least more closely resembling something which is a skill game. And I'm curious if you think, as a society, I would argue that we're probably getting less sort of puritanical in nature. And do you think that the future of poker in the media, or the future of poker in pop culture, does reflect more accurately the game?
That's a good question. The last chapter of the book is called Poker in the Future.
I haven't read the book yet, by the way, but...
And that's a pretty bold title for the last chapter. And I talk a little bit mainly about the game and what I think is going to happen with the game. I think it's going to stay popular, and factors that are going to affect the way people think about poker in the future. I kind of get into that a little bit. I actually don't talk too much about how it's going to be represented in popular culture, your question. I feel like it's going to probably be similar. Although I think that talking about the skill component of the game, I think that's something that's part of the conversation a lot more today than it was before the boom anyway. And that now, when you watch poker on TV, showing you percentages, and they're talking about odds and ranges and all this kind of stuff. And the people who wander over and watch those shows, the non-poker people who tune in, they're realizing, that poker is not, it's not like roulette, and so that kind of filters into, movies and TV shows and where people create fictional scenarios involving poker. The skill component does sort of come into things. So like Molly's Game, or like these other, although that's based on a true story, but other examples of poker in popular culture are maybe a little more amenable to the skill component and presenting it.
Well, and it's interesting to consider that actually, one of the reasons I think that poker is even so frequently found in television and movies and whatnot is that, exactly like you're saying, these are epic moments. These are moments which naturally create, potentially adversarial situations, life-changing amounts of money, et cetera. But I'm really interested, you mentioned, trying to find some old publications and old, journals, newspapers, magazines, maybe things that the rest of us are less familiar with or haven't seen. What are some of the things that we can look for in the book that you discovered about the way that people are talking about poker outside of just, Maverick and Casino Royale and some of the, the more clear ways that we see it?
Yeah, so like that chapter, the chapter's Poker on the Newsstand, and so it's magazines, it's non-poker magazines, like news magazines and entertainment magazines and men's and women's magazines and things like that. Talking about poker, I went through all of these examples and discovered it's interesting because you get lots of warnings about poker there, leading, like, some of the women's magazines are interesting because they are warning about poker being, the step down that road to other gambling, losing all your money. But there's a lot, it's interesting in those magazines as well, they kind of romanticize the game. Or what attracts them to the subject of poker is just how interesting and curious it is for these guys gambling all this money and sort of in the 20th century being sort of versions of those Old West characters who are putting it all on the line, and it's like the cowboys at the poker table kind of thing. And so they really kind of play that up, and it's the reason why like Sports Illustrated would send people to the World Series of Poker to report on it, because there's something really intriguing about these characters and the situation, and for them, how it's like a sport. There's kind of that crossover maybe. But so to me, it reflects sort of the paradox in America, generally speaking, where America, poker is a favorite activity. It's a favorite card game in the country. Millions of people play it and love it. But it's also kind of a favorite game to censure and criticize and prohibit and make laws against and that kind of thing. That paradox, you kind of see it in those magazines where they're presenting the good of poker, but they're also really highlighting kind of the dangerous or the outlaw aspects of the game that make it intriguing and kind of, maybe is one of the reasons why some of us were attracted to the game and still find it interesting. That there's something a little bit, you put yourself at risk, even in a small way, more than you would in your non-poker life. And so that's in that, and that comes up in other chapters as well, that sort of paradox.
I, for one, cannot wait to read it. I think, especially coming from a film and television background, it's definitely something that I need to put on my roster. Now, should I say want to purchase this, where might I go?
You can go to D&B Poker is the publisher, so you go to the D&B Poker website and you'll find it. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all the places that sell books online. You can just type in poker and pop culture and you'll find it.
And up next is the audiobook. Are you going to start your voice acting career?
I actually just recorded the audiobook, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, reading this entire thing. And there's also an ebook, so if you do that, like for the Kindle. But yeah, the audiobook will probably be ready in 2 or 3 weeks or something. So
Mama loves her audiobooks, I'm not going to lie. I like both. I like all the different variations. I like to mix it up, but I cannot wait to purchase this. We will, of course, put links below for you guys in the description if you also would like to purchase the books, and let us know in the comments what you think. Let us know how you ended up how you ended up getting through and what your takeaways were. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Seamus. You're the best. You're on PokerNews.com.